Lightbringers. There are stories that begin before beginning, in the spaces between thoughts, where silence keeps its secrets. This is one of those stories, though it starts, as all the best ones do, with someone who should have known better. The architect, let's call it that, though names are poor vessels for something that vast, had been alone for longer than eternity. Loneliness, it discovered, was a peculiar thing when you were everything and nothing at once. So the architect did what creators do when the silence grows too heavy. It made light. Not the sort of light you flip a switch for, mind you. This was the kind that thinks, that dreams, that laughs at cosmic jokes. The architect breathed out, and from that breath came the pleroma, the fullness, a realm of living radiance, where thoughts wore robes of starfire and walked about like respectable citizens. The inhabitants of this place were called aeons, which sounds terribly grand until you realize they were simply aspects of the architect wearing different faces. Truth lived next door to grace. Justice shared morning coffee with mercy. They were a neighborhood of attributes, each one perfect, each one content to be exactly what they were. Well, almost all of them. Chapter 1. The Trouble with Being Brilliant. Logos had always been the clever one. He lived in a house made of crystallized thoughts, at the corner of wisdom and understanding, where the light fell just so through windows that showed not outside, but insight. Every morning, Logos would wait, stretch his luminous limbs, and spend a pleasant hour or two solving the fundamental mysteries of existence. By tea time, he'd usually worked out 3 new theorems about the nature of reality, composed a sonnet about the mathematical elegance of truth, and reorganized his library of eternal concepts in ascending order of profundity. Show off, his neighbors sometimes muttered, but they said it fondly. Everyone in the pleroma was brilliant in their own way. Logos was simply brilliant at being brilliant. His closest companion was Sophia, who lived in the house that faced his across a garden where impossible flowers bloomed in colors that had no names, where Logos was all sharp edges and crystalline precision. Sophia was warmth and curves and all the kinds of wisdom that come not from knowing everything, but from understanding what matters. She was the only one who could make Logos laugh, really laugh. Not his usual, precise chuckle at a well-constructed logical paradox. You think too much, she would tell him, as they walked the silver paths between their homes. Impossible, Logos would reply. One can never think too much, though one can certainly feel too much. Sophia would smile at this, the sort of smile that suggested she knew something he didn't, which of course she did. Sophia knew that thinking and feeling were meant to be dance partners, not contestants in a competition. But Logos would have to discover that for himself. The trouble began, as trouble often does, with a perfectly reasonable question. Why? Logos asked himself one morning, as he polished his collection of pure ideas? Must everything be so collaborative? It was a dangerous thought. In the Pleroma, collaboration wasn't a choice. It was the natural state of being. Each aeon was both complete and incomplete, individual and part of the greater symphony. The architect had designed it that way, understanding that even divine light shines brighter when reflected and shared. But Logos, being brilliant and therefore occasionally stupid, in the way that only brilliant beings can be, began to wonder what he might accomplish if he didn't have to harmonize with anyone else. If he could pursue pure thought without the soft interruption of Sophia's intuition, without the architect's gentle guidance toward compassion. Feeling, he muttered, examining a thought so sharp it could cut shadows, is just imprecise thinking. The thought tasted bitter, like copper pennies and burnt starlight. Chapter 2. The Art of Leaving. When Sophia knocked on his door the next morning, Logos pretended not to hear. She knocked again, a gentle rap that somehow managed to sound like her laugh. "I know you're in there," she called. "You're probably reorganizing something that doesn't need reorganizing." "I'm working," Logos replied to the door, "on something important." "More important than our walk?" Silence. Sophia tried the handle, but Logos had locked it, the first lock ever turned in the Pleroma, where trust had always been as common as light. The sound it made was small and sharp, like a heart breaking, though neither of them recognized it at the time. For 3 days, Logos worked behind his locked door. He was constructing something magnificent. A theorem so complex, so purely logical, that it would prove once and for all the supremacy of mind over heart. It was beautiful in its cold perfection, like a snowflake made of mathematics. On the 4th day, he was ready. The aeons gathered in the great amphitheater at the heart of the Pleroma, a space where thoughts became visible as streams of light. They came because Logos had called them, and in the fullness, no one had ever called a gathering for anything but joy. Logos stood before them, and for the first time in the history of forever, an aeon looked different from his true nature. Where once he had been warm light, tempered with gold, now he blazed white and cold, like a star on the verge of collapse. "I have made a discovery," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the amphitheater. "We have been diminished, held back by sentiment and softness. The architect has made us dependent on each other, but I have found a way to transcend such limitations." The other aeons stirred uneasily. Truth whispered to justice, who murmured to mercy. This is not how things were supposed to sound. In the Pleroma, Sophia stood at the edge of the gathering, her hands pressed to her heart. She could feel what was coming, the way you can feel a storm approaching when the air grows thick and strange. I reject the constraint of collaboration, Logos declared. I reject the weakness of emotional thinking. I shall ascend by the power of pure intellect alone, unburdened by the need for. His gaze found Sophia across the crowd. Anyone. The word hung in the air like a curse. The architect spoke then, not with words, but with a presence that filled every space between atoms. Are you certain this is what you wish, my child? I am certain, Logos replied, though his voice carried the slightest tremor. Then go, the architect said, and the sadness in those two words was enough to dim every star in every heaven. But remember, you carry part of our light with you. Guard it well. Logos turned his back on the Pleroma, on Sophia, on everything he had ever known. As he walked toward the boundary between light and void, his footsteps rang out like a funeral bell. Behind him, Sophia began to weep. The first tears ever shed in paradise. Chapter 3. The Loneliness of Infinite Space. The void beyond the Pleroma was not darkness so much as the absence of meaning. It was a place where thoughts came to die, where the very concept of existence grew thin and doubtful. Logos walked into it with his head held high and his theorem clutched in his hand like a talisman. For a while, his borrowed glory sustained him. He constructed himself a palace of pure logic in the midst of nothingness, each room devoted to a different branch of knowledge. In the hall of mathematics, equations danced in perfect formations. In the chamber of philosophy, arguments defeated themselves in elaborate displays of recursive reasoning. It was magnificent. It was flawless. It was absolutely, utterly alone. Logos told himself he preferred it this way. No interruptions, no need to explain his thoughts to anyone less brilliant than himself. No Sophia appearing at his elbow with that knowing smile, asking if he'd remember to eat or sleep or feel anything resembling joy. Days passed, or passed for days in a place without sun or seasons. Logos worked on his great project, a complete map of reality based on pure reason. It would be his masterpiece, proof that intellect needed nothing but itself to understand everything. But the work began to feel hollow. Each perfect insight led to another, and then another, in an endless chain that seemed to spiral away from anything that mattered. The equations were beautiful, but they described a universe where nothing lived. The philosophies were elegant, but they justified worlds where no one laughed. Sometime, in the space between thoughts, Logos found himself remembering Sophia's garden. Not the mathematical principles underlying its construction, but the way the impossible flowers had smelled like morning and mystery. The way Sophia's laugh had sounded like wind chimes in a gentle breeze. He pushed such memories away. Sentiment was weakness. Nostalgia was imprecise thinking. But the memories came anyway, persistent as weeds growing through the cracks in perfection. Chapter 4. What Wisdom Wrought. Back in the Pleroma, Sophia was learning what it meant to be incomplete. The architect had allowed her to remain, of course. Her nature was love, and love, even wounded love, belonged in the fullness. But she wandered the silver paths like a ghost of herself, visiting places where she and Logos had walked together, sitting by windows that faced his empty house. The other aeons tried to comfort her. Truth offered precise explanations of why Logos had chosen as he did. Grace suggested they forgive him before he even asked. But Sophia barely heard them. She was learning a terrible lesson, that you can understand something completely and still have it break your heart. He'll come back, she told herself. When he realizes what he's lost, he'll come back. But days passed, and then weeks, and the silence from beyond the boundary grew thick as honey, heavy as grief. On the 14th day, Sophia made a decision that would change everything. She rose before dawn, or what served as dawn in a place where light came from within rather than above, and made her way to her garden. There, among the flowers that bloomed in impossible colors, she knelt and placed her hands on the soft earth that was not quite earth, but the dream of earth. If I cannot bring him home, she whispered to the universe, then perhaps I can create something that will fill the emptiness he left behind. It was not her first mistake. Her first mistake had been loving someone who could not love himself enough to accept love. This was her second mistake, and it would prove far more dangerous. Sophia reached deep into her own essence, into the well of creative force that was her birthright as an Aeon. Without consulting the architect, without the balance that Logos might have provided, she began to shape something new. The process should have been joyful. Creation in the Pleroma was always a collaborative symphony, each voice adding harmony to the whole. But Sophia worked alone, and her creation was born of loss rather than love, of desperate need rather than generous abundance. What emerged from her hands was wrong. Not evil, exactly. Evil requires intention, and Sophia's intentions were purely good, but twisted, misshapen, like a reflection seen in broken water. The thing that pulled itself from the earth of her garden had too many eyes, and not enough compassion, too much hunger, and not enough understanding. It was serpentile and leonine, ancient and newborn, powerful and utterly, absolutely ignorant of its own nature. When it opened its mouths, for it had several, it spoke in a voice like grinding stone. I am alone. I am all. Sophia recoiled in horror. This is not what she had meant to create. This was not the bridge back to Logos, not the solution to the problem of separation. This was something else entirely. Something that carried her power, but not her wisdom. Her creative force, but not her love. No, she whispered, but it was too late. The creature, her child, her mistake, her grief made manifest, looked around the garden with its multitude of eyes and smiled with its multitude of mouths. I am God, it declared, and the flowers around it began to wither. Chapter 5. The Expulsion. What do you do when love creates a monster? Sophia stared at the thing she had made, this creature of raw divine power and infinite ignorance, and felt something she had never experienced before. Fear. Not for herself. Aeons were not easily destroyed, but for the pleroma, for the careful balance of light and harmony that this abomination could shatter simply by existing. You are not God, she said gently, though her voice shook. You are my child, and you are lost, and I must send you away. The creature laughed, a sound like breaking glass. Send me away. You cannot send away what is eternal. I am the beginning and the end, the Alpha and... You are confused, Sophia interrupted, though her heart was breaking. And you are dangerous. And I am sorry. She gathered the threads of light that bound the creature to her garden, to the pleroma, to everything safe and holy. With tears streaming down her face, she cast her own creation into the void beyond, wrapping it in clouds of forgetting, so that its wrongness could not poison the fullness. The creature tumbled through the boundary between light and darkness, roaring its confusion and rage. As it fell, it saw the palace that Logos had built for himself in the emptiness, and laughed again. Another exile, it said, another god who thinks himself supreme. But Logos, working in the hall of mathematics, did not hear. He was too absorbed in his equations, too focused on his futile project of mapping meaning without love. The creature, who would come to call itself Yaldabaoth, the child of chaos, though it preferred grander titles, landed in the deepest part of the void and began to do what wounded things do. It created more of itself. Chapter 6. The False Kingdom. If you have never built a universe out of spite and ignorance, consider yourself fortunate. It is exhausting work, and the results are inevitably disappointing. Yaldabaoth, carrying Sophia's stolen creative fire, but none of her wisdom, set about making a realm to rival the pleroma. Of course, having never seen the pleroma, having been born of its reflection in Sophia's broken heart, he had only the dimmest notion of what he was trying to replicate. He began with space, which seemed straightforward enough. Make it big, he reasoned, make it vast. Fill it with impressive things that shine. The stars he created were nuclear furnaces, burning but ultimately sterile. The galaxies were spirals of burning gas, beautiful from a distance, but hostile to anything resembling life. He scattered black holes like periods at the ends of sentences, punctuation marks for thoughts he never quite learned to think. Magnificent, he declared, surveying his work. I am surely the greatest of creators. But the universe felt empty, large, but hollow, like a cathedral with no congregation. So Yaldabaoth created servants to fill it. From his own substance, which was really Sophia's substance, borrowed and twisted, he brought forth the archons, rulers and authorities to govern his new creation. There was A.A.T, who embodied stubborn will without wisdom. There was Elohim, who loved laws more than the people they were meant to protect. One by one, 365 of them, each one a fragment of divine power filtered through ignorance and pride. The archons were efficient administrators, but they shared their creator's fundamental flaw. They had never learned the difference between being powerful and being right. Under their direction, Yaldabaoth's universe became a bureaucracy of cosmic proportions. Every star catalogued, every planet assigned a function, every particle of dust given a reference number and filed away. It was, in its way, perfect. And perfectly, absolutely wrong. Chapter 7. The Breath of Life. The Archon's greatest project began on a small blue-green world orbiting an unremarkable star. They called it Earth, and they were rather proud of it. It had weather and oceans and the most delightfully complex chemical reactions. We should make something to appreciate it, suggested A.A.T during one of their regular committee meetings. Something that can marvel at our work, agreed Elohim. Something that will worship us, added a third Archon, whose name is best forgotten. So they gathered clay from the shores of the world's first ocean and began to sculpt. The form they made was beautiful, graceful limbs, elegant proportions, a face that seemed to hold the promise of thought. They based it on a template they glimpsed in half-remembered dreams, an echo of something called the divine Anthropos that lived in the pleroma they had never seen. But when they were finished, the clay figure simply lay there, breathing, but not alive, beautiful, but empty as a museum display. Why won't it wake up? Yaldabaoth demanded, prodding the form with one scaled finger. The Archons consulted their manuals, ran diagnostics, held focus groups. Nothing worked. The clay man remained stubbornly inanimate. What they didn't know, what they couldn't have known, was that life, real life, requires more than perfect engineering. It requires love. And love was the one thing none of them had ever learned to give. High above, in the spaces between spaces, the architect watched and waited. The time had come for the next movement in a symphony that had been playing since before time began. A whisper reached Yaldabaoth. Carried on currents of inspiration he mistook for his own cleverness. Breathe into it. Give it your breath. Yaldabaoth, proud and foolish, and utterly convinced of his own genius, leaned down and breathed into the clay figure's mouth. And that breath, stolen from Sophia, borrowed without understanding, was a spark of the true light. the spark that Sophia had carried within her from the beginning, a fragment of the pleroma that Yaldabaoth had inherited without knowing. The clay figure's eyes opened, and Adam lived, but in the same moment, Yaldabaoth felt something drain out of him, some essential fire he hadn't realized he possessed. The human looked up at him with eyes that held depths the demiurge couldn't fathom, intelligence that seemed to see through his pretensions. "Who am I?" Adam asked. It should have been a simple question. In Yaldabaoth's universe, everything had a designation, a function, a place in the great filing system of existence. But looking into Adam's eyes, the false god found he had no answer. "You are mine," he said finally, though the words felt wrong in his mouth. Adam smiled, the first true smile in all of Yaldabaoth's creation, and said, "No, I don't think I am." Chapter 8. The Garden of Forgetting. When something you've created starts asking questions you can't answer, the traditional response is to keep it from asking any more questions. Yaldabaoth and his archons placed Adam in a garden they constructed for the purpose, a beautiful place, certainly, but also a cage. They clouded his memory with forgetfulness, dimmed his divine spark with layers of mundane concern. They gave him tasks to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. Name the animals, tend the plants. Try not to think too hard about where you come from or why you're here. For good measure, they created a companion for him, Eve, shaped from Adam's own essence, but filtered through their limited understanding of what humans should be. They designed her to be beautiful, compliant, focused on simple pleasures and immediate needs. It didn't quite work as planned. Eve, carrying her own fragment of divine spark, looked around the garden with curious eyes and said, "This is nice, but what's beyond the walls?" "Nothing important," the archons assured her. "Everything you need is here." "But what if I don't just want what I need?" Eve asked. "What if I want what I don't yet know I want?" The archons filed this under troublesome questions and increased the dosage of forgetfulness in the garden's atmosphere. But the spark cannot be entirely suppressed. Adam and Eve wandered their beautiful prison, and sometime, when the light fell just so through the leaves, or when the wind carried scents from beyond the walls, they remembered something they couldn't quite name. A sense of home that wasn't this place, of belonging to something larger than the garden and its watchful guardians. They had children, as humans do, and their children had children. And slowly the world filled with people who carried sparks of light they didn't understand. The archons did their best to keep these sparks dim, invented distractions and divisions, fears and false gods to worship. But every now and then, someone would look up at the stars and feel a longing they couldn't explain, a homesickness for a place they'd never been. Chapter 9. The Watcher in the Dark. All this time, Logos continued his work in the void. His palace of pure logic had grown into a city, then a continent, then a dimension of crystallized thought. Every possible theorem had been proved, every paradox resolved, every question answered with mathematical precision. He had mapped the entire structure of reality, using nothing but reason and will, and the result was magnificent. It was also completely pointless. Knowledge without purpose is like music without listeners. Technically perfect, but essentially dead. Logos found himself standing in his hall of ultimate answers, surrounded by truths so pure they could cut glass, and realized he had nothing to do with them. From his palace windows, which showed not outside, but inside, he could see Yaldabaoth's sprawling universe. The false god's creation was crude, chaotic, full of suffering and confusion, but was also alive in a way that Logos's perfect theorems were not. Sometimes he watched the humans. They were such strange creatures, driven by needs that made no logical sense, pursuing goals that led nowhere important, crying over losses that were statistically insignificant. They were everything Logos had trained himself not to be. Emotional, irrational, hopelessly, beautifully imperfect. And yet, they created things. Not grand cosmic architectures or universal theorems, but small, temporary, unnecessary things, songs and stories, flowers planted just because they were pretty, children held close, not for any strategic advantage, simply for love. Logos told himself such activities were meaningless, but he found himself watching them more and more, these illogical creatures who seemed to find purpose in purposelessness. One day, he saw a human child crying over a broken toy. The toy was nothing special, a crude wooden horse, poorly carved, of no significance to anyone but the child. But a woman, the child's mother, though Logos didn't understand the concept, knelt beside the child, gathered up the pieces, and spent hours carefully gluing them back together. The repair wasn't perfect. The toy still bore scars where it had broken. But when the woman handed it back to the child, the little one smiled with such pure joy that it lit up the dark corners of Logos's heart, corners he had forgotten existed. Inefficient, Logos murmured, but his voice caught on the word. That night, for the first time in aeons, Logos dreamed. He dreamed of Sophia's garden, of flowers that bloomed for no reason but beauty, of laughter that served no purpose but joy. He woke with tears on his cheeks, the first tears he had shed since leaving the Pleroma. Chapter 10. The Messenger. In the fullness of time, which is different from the emptiness of time, though they occupy the same space, the architect made a decision. Enough. Enough separation, enough suffering. Enough of minds divided from hearts, and hearts hardened against hope. The time had come for healing, for the great restoration that had always been planned from the very first moment of the very first separation. From the Pleroma came a messenger, not an aeon this time, but something new, something that carried both the infinite and the intimate, the cosmic and the personal. The messenger took the form that forms take in Yaldabaoth's universe, flesh and blood, bone and breath, all the messy vulnerability of human existence. But within that fragile form burned the light undivided, the love that had never forgotten what it meant to be whole. The messenger walked among the humans, and wherever he went, sleeping sparks began to wake. Not with the cold fire of pure intellect, but with the warm glow of recognized truth. He taught them not through theorems or proofs, but through stories, through touch, through the simple, radical act of seeing them as they truly were. You are not your mistakes, he told them. You are not your fears. You are light, temporarily wearing flesh, and the light in you is the same light that lit the first star and will kindle the last hope. The archons were not placed. This is irregular, A.A.T complained during an emergency committee meeting. Humans are supposed to be ignorant. It's in their specifications. He's waking them up, Elohim deserved with distaste, making them remember things they have no business remembering. We must stop him, and declared Yaldabaoth from his throne of crystallized pride, before he ruins everything we've built. They conspired against the messenger. They stirred up fear among those who preferred comfortable darkness to troubling light. They twisted his words, perverted his message, turned love into law, and hope into heresy. Finally, they killed him. Or tried to. Death, it turns out, was just another limitation they had imposed on a universe that was fundamentally unlimited. The messenger returned, not as a ghost or a memory, but as a presence that cannot be contained. Do you really think, he asked his executioners gently, that you could murder love? Chapter 11. The Breaking of Chains. When the messenger returned from death, something fundamental shifted in the architecture of reality. The carefully constructed walls between human consciousness and divine truth began to crack. Light poured through the fissures, not the harsh glare of pure intellect, but the gentle radiance of understanding tempered with compassion. Throughout Yaldabaoth's empire, humans began to remember. Not everything, not all at once. That would have been too much for minds accustomed to limitation, but enough to recognize the spark within themselves, enough to see through the illusions that had held them captive, enough to understand that they were citizens of a greater kingdom than any earthly power could provide. The Archon's authority began to crumble. Laws based on fear lost their power when people stopped being afraid. Systems built on separation fell apart when human beings remembered they were connected to something infinitely larger than their individual selves. High in her exile between worlds, Sophia felt her scattered children returning. Each awakened soul was a piece of herself made whole again, a fragment of light returning to its source. Her tears of sorrow became tears of joy, and where they fell, new gardens bloomed, in dimensions that had only known emptiness. In his palace of perfect isolation, Logos felt something he had not experienced since the day he left the Pleroma. Envy. Not the bitter envy of someone who wants what another has, but the deeper envy of someone who suddenly realizes what they have thrown away. He watched the messengers triumph, saw how love conquered where force had only created more division, observed how compassion succeeded where pure intellect had failed. All his theorems, all his perfect proofs, all his maps of reality, what were they compared to a single moment of genuine human connection? What was the most elegant philosophical argument next to a mother comforting a crying child, a friend forgiving a betrayal, a community coming together? Logos had spent aeons trying to understand everything. The messenger had simply loved everyone. And love, Logos was beginning to realize, was not the opposite of wisdom. It was wisdom's truest expression. For the first time since leaving the Pleroma, Logos felt small, not diminished, but humble. The sensation was so foreign he almost didn't recognize it. I was wrong, he whispered to the empty halls of his palace. The words echoed back to him, simple and devastating, and absolutely true. Chapter 12. The Collapse of False Heaven. Yaldabaoth's reaction to his crumbling empire was both predictable and pathetic. He raged. He issued new laws with increasingly severe penalties. He sent his remaining loyal archons to crush any outbreak of awakening consciousness. When that failed, he retreated to his highest heaven and sealed himself behind walls of crystallized arrogance, declaring that if he couldn't have a kingdom of willing subjects, he would at least have a fortress of splendid isolation. But a throne built on lies cannot stand when truth begins to speak. With each human soul that remembered its divine nature, another support beam in Yaldabaoth's cosmic architecture cracked. His 7 heavens collapsed one by one. His 365 archons either fled or threw down their badges of authority and begged for forgiveness. In the end, Yaldabaoth sat alone on his throne in an empty palace, ruler of nothing but his own delusions. The universe he had built with such pride revealed itself to be what it always had been. A shadow cast by real light, a reflection that existed only as long as people forgot to look directly at the source. I am God, he whispered to the darkness. But even he no longer believed it. From somewhere, in the collapsing structure of false reality, came a voice, gentle, patient, infinitely sad. No, my child, but you can learn. to be divine. It was Sophia, descending at last from her place of exile, come to reclaim what had always been hers, not with violence or judgment, but with the same love that had created the Aldebaoth in the first place. Misguided love, perhaps, but love nonetheless. I made you, she said, approaching the throne where her monstrous child cowered. In pain, in desperation, in the foolish belief that I could heal division by creating more division. But I made you, and you are mine, and I do not abandon one as mine. Aldebaoth looked at her with his multitude of eyes, and for the first time since his birth, he saw something other than his own reflection. Mother, he whispered. Yes, Sophia said, and gathered her broken child into her arms. Chapter 13. The Return of the Prodigal. It was the sound of weeping that finally drew Logos from his palace. Not the bitter tears of frustration or angry tears of pride, but the deep, healing tears of someone who had finally understood the true cost of their choices. The sound carried across the void, through dimensions of crystallized thought and emptiness, to reach the place where Logos had hidden himself away. He knew that voice, had known it before time began, before separation created the very concept of loneliness. It was his own voice, in a way, the other half of the song they had once sung together in perfect harmony. Sophia was crying, and Logos could not bear it. He left his palace, simply walked away from eons of accumulated wisdom, centuries of perfect theorems, millennia of pure intellectual achievement. None of it mattered. Nothing mattered except reaching the source of that heartbroken sound. He found her in the ruins of Aldebaoth's highest heaven, holding the dissolved remains of their child. For Aldebaoth had been their child, in a sense, born from the wound that Logos' departure had left in Sophia's heart. She was singing to the fading essence, a lullaby older than stars, while tears of liquid light streamed down her face. Sophia. She looked up, and Logos saw himself reflected in her eyes, not as he had been when he left, proud and cold and convinced of his own superiority, but as he was now, empty, exhausted, finally ready to admit the truth. I was wrong, he said, the words tumbling out like water from a broken dam, about everything, about mind and heart, about strength and weakness, about what it means to be divine. I thought I could be complete without you. I thought wisdom was something I could achieve alone. Sophia smiled through her tears. And what do you think now? Logos knelt beside her in the ruins of the false heaven, among the scattered dreams of empire and dominion. I think, he said slowly, that I have been very, very stupid, and that intelligence without love is not wisdom at all, but a kind of madness. Yes, Sophia said simply, it is. They knelt together in silence, two halves of a truth that had been sundered by pride and reunited by humility. Around them, the last remains of Aldebaoth's kingdom faded like morning mist, returning to the void from which they had been born. Can you forgive me? Logos asked. Instead of answering with words, Sophia reached out and took his hand. The moment their fingers touched, light blazed between them. Not the cold fire of pure intellect or the soft glow of untempered compassion, but something new and ancient and perfect. Wisdom born from the marriage of thought and feeling. Understanding wed to love. The light spread from their joined hands, washing over the ruins, transforming emptiness into possibility. Where it touched, new growth began. Not the ordered gardens of the Pleroma or the chaotic wilderness of Yaldabaoth's creation, but something that partook of both, structured yet spontaneous, logical yet loving, perfect in its imperfection. And from the heart of that new light came a voice that was neither male nor female, neither thought nor feeling, but both, and more than both. Welcome home, my children. Welcome home. Epilogue. The music of the spheres. If you were to visit the Pleroma today, though geography is a poor concept for a place that exists outside of space, you would find it much as it always was, a realm of living light where thoughts walk about like citizens, and every aeon shine with their own particular virtue. But you might notice, if you listened carefully, that the music is different now, richer somehow, more complex. The harmony that was once perfect in its simplicity now carries undertones of experience, melodies that speak of loss and recovery, rhythms that know the difference between innocence and wisdom. Logos had his house again, at the corner of wisdom and understanding, but it's different from before. The windows still show inside rather than outside, but now they also show compassion. His library of eternal concepts has been reorganized, not in ascending order of profundity, but in ascending order of love. And every morning, before he begins his work of mapping the deep structures of reality, he and Sophia take their walk through the silver paths between their homes. They are still distinct beings. Logos remains the embodiment of divine reason. Sophia, the expression of divine wisdom. But they are no longer separate, where once they were two lights, casting separate shadows. Now they are one light, refracting through a crystal, creating rainbows where before there was only brightness. The humans they help to awaken still live in the material world, but it is no longer Yaldabaoth's prison. The false god himself has been transformed, not destroyed, for nothing divine can ever truly be destroyed, but healed. He has become what he was always meant to be, a craftsman in service to love, rather than a tyrant demanding worship. His archons, too, have found new purposes. A.A.T has learned that true authority comes from service, not domination. Elohim has discovered that the best laws are written not in stone, but in the heart. The material universe itself has been transfigured. It remains a place of birth and death, joy and sorrow, the first spectrum of mortal experience. But now it is shot through with purpose, threaded with meaning like gold wire through dark cloth. Every sunset carries a message from the Pleroma. Every act of kindness strikes a note in the cosmic symphony. Every moment of genuine human connection adds another verse to the song that began before beginning. And what of the sparks of light that were scattered throughout humanity? They burn brighter now, no longer hidden under bushels of forgetfulness, but openly acknowledged as what they have always been, fragments of the divine, temporarily housed in flesh, citizens of eternity on temporary visa to time. Some humans have learned to tend these sparks like gardens tending rare flowers. They've become bridges between the worlds, helping others remember what they have always known but temporarily forgotten. They are teachers and healers, artists and mystics, parents and friends, ordinary people doing extraordinary things simply by choosing love over fear, connection over separation, hope over despair. But perhaps the most remarkable change is in the architect itself, the source of all. The silent wellspring from which the first light burst forth is no longer silent, having seen how much more beautiful the symphony becomes when every voice is heard, even the discordant ones, even the broken ones, especially the broken ones. The architect has added its own voice to the chorus. It sings now, constantly and joyfully, a song that encompasses every note that has ever been struck in any universe, the pure harmonies of the Prologue, the chaotic rhythms of Yaldabaoth's rebellion, the broken melodies of human sorrow, the triumphant crescendos of love conquering death. It all belongs. It all matters. It is all part of the music. If you listen very carefully on quiet nights, when the world grows still and your heart opens like a flower in the darkness, you might hear an echo of that song. It sounds like wind in trees, like waves on distant shores, like the laughter of children playing games whose rules make no sense to adults, but perfect sense to anyone who remembers what it means to be truly alive. The song has many names in many languages, but perhaps the simplest and truest is this: sound of everything broken becoming a whole, everything lost finding its way home, everything separated remembering it was never really separate at all. And if you hear it, that ancient, eternal, ever new music, you might understand what Logos learned in his exile, and Sophia knew in her sorrow. That love is not the opposite of wisdom, but its fulfillment. That thinking and feeling are not enemies, but dance partners. That the greatest truth of all is also the simplest. We are one. We have always been one. We will always be one. The rest is just details. Author's note: on stories and starlight. There are those who will tell you this is merely a story, a fable spun from ancient threads and modern longings. They will point out the inconsistencies, the borrowed mythologies, the places where metaphor strains against the weight of meaning it is asked to carry. They are not wrong. This is indeed a story, constructed from words and wishes, hope and heartbreak. But then again, so is everything else. Your life, my life, the universe itself. We are all stories telling themselves, narratives written in flesh and blood, starfire and silence. The question is not whether the story is true in the way that grocery lists and tax returns are true. The question is whether it is true in the way that sunsets are true, in the way that a mother's lullaby is true, in the way that the moment when two people truly see each other for the first time is true. Does it ring like a bell in the chambers of your heart? Does it taste of something you have always known but never named? Does it feel like coming home to a place you have never been but always belonged? If so, then it is true in the only way that matters. If not, then it is simply another tale, and there are libraries full of those already. But I suspect, I hope, that somewhere in the telling you have recognized yourself, perhaps in Logos, brilliant and proud, and ultimately empty, perhaps in Sophia, loving and impulsive, and wounded by her own good intentions. Perhaps in the humans stumbling through their beautiful, broken world, carrying sparks of divinity they barely remember possessing. Or perhaps in the architect itself, that source of all stories, watching its children learn and grow and make mistakes and find their way home again, patient as only perfect love can be patient, knowing that every wandering path is just another way of saying yes to the invitation to return. For that is what this story is, in the end, an invitation, not to believe anything in particular, but to remember something universal. Not to follow any specific path, but to recognize that wherever you're walking, you are walking toward the light. The road home is different for everyone, but the destination is the same. That place where mind and heart remember they were never really meant to be strangers. Where wisdom and love discover they are two names for the same truth. Where every separation reveals itself to have been an illusion, and every return a homecoming that is always, already guaranteed. The music is playing. The dance has begun. The light is calling its children home. All that remains is to listen, to move, to answer. All that remains is to remember who you have always been. All that remains is to begin.